Hello, and welcome to the Australia-Indonesia Centre and our In Conversation webinar about agriculture, technology and investment in Indonesia. I'm Helen Brown. I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Kulin nations of the land from which I'm hosting today's webinar in Melbourne, Victoria, and the Yagara people of the land on which our guest, Dr. Scott Waldron, is joining us from in Brisbane and Queensland. And for all our speakers, we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Now, as you know, the Centre's mission is to build on the links between the two countries. And one of the ways we do that is through these webinars. We bring together researchers, industry, civil society and government to discuss some of the important issues that we are grappling with. And the coronavirus pandemic has reminded us very well as to how important our food supply and our food supply chain is to the health of a nation and to our global stability. The focus really is on food, agriculture and technology, and the role that technology and investment plays in this very important sector. Now, we're going to discuss all that with 4 fabulous guest speakers. Before I do that though, before I introduce them to you, we are very fortunate today to be joined by a very special opening speaker. Bapak Anang Noegroho Setyo Muljono is the Director of Food and Agriculture at BAPPENAS. Now, BAPPENAS is the Indonesian government's agency in charge of the planning, policy and strategy for the nation's development programs, including urgent and large-scale programs. And as you can imagine, agriculture and food are a very significant part of that development planning. Could you please welcome, wherever you are listening to this webinar, Pak Anang Noegroho Setyo Muljono for the opening remarks. Terima kasih ya Bapak.
Thank you very much indeed, Ibu Helen. Selamat pagi. Very good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me for this session. From BAPPENAS side, we value this session is really quite timely and important, since there are 3 aspects. First, referring to our great collaboration between those 2 countries, Indonesia and Australia. We've been enjoying many activities on the partnership. We can take the example as like Prisma. I think is everybody knowing about this activity. This is really quite significant, giving us the support how the small farmers that most of us working in this agriculture practices in Indonesia can have perspective of how to link with the market access, or in the big terms, we are developing the market system development. I think this is a significant partnership, how to bring our small scale farmers from just only thinking about the livelihood as farming as activities, but now they are transforming or putting another dimension. We call it as a business dimension in their practices. The second aspect is I can share with you that even we are in the pandemic situation at this moment, fortunately our agriculture still having a capacity to contribute to our GDP and having a good growth, and also with other sectors, information and telecommunication. Both of those 2 sectors are in the positive, while the positive growth, while at the same time other sectors have been contracting. And I think on this perspective, if we are talking about the innovation, innovation is also our public narrative. If our policy narrative within our next 5 years development plan within agriculture and food sectors, if you could have a chance to see our 5 years development plan in our RPJMN 2020 in 2024, it was quite clear that the government would like to improve and increase the technological content or the innovation content within the application of our farming activities. So I think I'm really hope that this session could contribute inputs, response, and the supportive additional narrative that could be applied into our development activities, especially for the agri-food sector. The third aspect, Indonesia enjoying all of the full system within our food system. At least there are 4 systems that at this moment we are quite significantly intensive to monitor. Of course, we have a climate system. There are quite significant fluctuation at this moment, climate change, and Indonesia also blessed with the full ecosystem from land, water, and ocean. And also we are having a varieties of the socio-economic system. Those are the 3 systems that at this moment, as a government, we would like to keep this in a more resilient and sustained. Resilience is a key core of our focus at this moment. We would like to prove that this system can avoid any damage or any not bad impacts for our food system. So climate system, ecosystem, and socio-economic ecosystem, those are the strategic environment while we are working at this moment, especially in the agri-food system. Even into our food system itself, we are experiencing, while in this quite challenging situation in a pandemic period, we are getting a quite significant demand shock. So I think this is also our big homeworks, how to maintain the incentive for our farmers. They can usually always producing and the quote-unquote normal basis, while in the same time they are also facing a challenge in the demand. So in this point, government, especially BAPPENAS, exercising whether any transformation from the previously just normal system into the more resilient and sustained food system. So those are the 3 aspects that I can share with you at this moment, and I'm hoping through this session we can discuss more and giving more additional inputs for us. And having said that, I'm officially, or I'm gladly to open this discussion. Thank you very much indeed, and being keep safe and healthy. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Pak. Terima kasih. Yeah. Thank you for that lovely introduction and opening, and touching on obviously and definitely some of the areas that we're going to discuss in the next hour: sustainability, resilience, how to make our food systems not just better, but better for the communities and environment that they exist in. So let's meet our panelists with that in mind. And I'm firstly going to introduce you to Stephen McFallan, who's the co-developer of transit technology from CSIRO, which is Australia's national science research agency. He's the co-developer of a strategic simulation model called Transit, a supply chain and logistics model originally developed to provide solutions to the investment challenges faced in Northern Australia, actually, as part of a government priority. The tool compares major infrastructure investments and policy changes for reducing transport costs to the multi-billion-dollar agri-food industry. And Stephen and his team have been looking at how this technology can be applied elsewhere, including in Indonesia. And quick question to all the panelists before we get into the question areas. Stephen, what excites you the most about technology in agriculture at the moment?
Hi, Helen, and thanks very much, and thanks also to Anang for that guidance around reminding us about the development goals and connections of farmers and resilience. What excites me actually is, so being a bit of a computer nerd myself, I really enjoy the current computing environment, the advancements in computing that offers the technology to do the type of computational challenges posed by the modelling we do. So using these high performance computers and the fact that we have remote cloud systems allows us to generate much more information and provide that information more seamlessly and easily to remote users. So even allowing for the fact that they may have fairly minimal computing technology, these advancements really are very beneficial, particularly those in the agricultural industry who are in remote locations.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. And remote locations, I think that's a good point, which we'll touch on later. Dr. Melony Sellars is the CEO and co-founder of Genics. This is a shrimp technology company. She herself is a global shrimp or prawn expert, 20 years of experience in aquaculture and an in-depth background in shrimp aquaculture in particular. She has extensive expertise in the application of novel biotech solutions for industry, genetics and breeding programs, and the company's disease testing technology is used around the world, including in Indonesia. Welcome, Dr. Sellars, nice to have you with us. What excites you the most about technology and agriculture at the moment?
Thank you for the introduction. I think what excites us here the most about technology in agriculture is the rate at which we can drive disruptive change and improve how we farm our food. And so as an example, historically with genetic improvement and testing for pathogens to improve production performance, it takes year on year on year on year to obtain small gains in genetics and health status. But with the technology, we can disrupt these industries and make those changes within very short periods of time. And that will build in resilience as we apply the innovative technologies that we're developing for the industries.
That's great. Thank you, Melony. I'd now like to go to Imron Zuhri, who's the CTO and co-founder of HARA. Now, if you have an interest in Indonesia, you will have heard of HARA, H-A-R-A, a company in Indonesia which uses blockchain technology to collect and disseminate information about the agricultural sector to provide better insights from on the ground. Now, the company sprang from DataBot, of which Imron is also a co-founder and CTO, and that uses machine learning and AI, including in territory management, industrial, internet, supply chain analytics, and precision agriculture. So it all ties in together. He's a very busy man. Thank you for your time today, Imron. What excites you the most at the moment about technology and agriculture?
I think for a country as diverse as us and as complex as us, I think accessibility of this technology is the most important. You know, a smartphone is getting cheaper. You can buy a new one here, an Android one for like $20. So that is important. And I think that even though this pandemic situation creates a lot of problem, but also hopefully will accelerate the penetration of technology, because now, you know, the government trying to expedite the coverage area of the internet and everything, but also like satellite is also getting cheaper. And I think I agree with Scott, all this cloud technology makes the agriculture sectors, especially farmers, will have access to more and more of this technology to speed up the process of the agricultural transformation into digital stage, I think.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Imron. And to our fourth speaker, Dr. Scott Waldron, who is, of course, a senior fellow with the Australia-Indonesia Centre. We're very happy to have him on board. Also a senior research fellow and lecturer in the School of Agriculture and Food Sciences in the Faculty of Science at the University of Queensland. Scott grew up on a cattle property. Yay, I come from a farming background too, and specialises in international business, Asian studies and agricultural economics. Unfortunately, I haven't done agricultural economics, but that's why we have Scott on board. He has conducted 25 agricultural development programs in China, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and is co-lead researcher on the AIC's PAIR project to look at the seaweed industry in South Sulawesi and find ways to improve production, value add and sustainability. Scott, lovely to have you with us today. Thanks for your time. What excites you the most about agricultural technology at the moment?
Thanks Helen, and for the Australia-Indonesia Centre and colleagues. I guess the most exciting thing to happen in agriculture, probably in history, was the Green Revolution. And you all remember there was some brilliant Indonesian agricultural scientists working in international teams that developed dwarf varieties, especially of rice, that were able to uptake nutrients without lodging, without falling over. And there was a whole series of technologies that meant that Indonesia went from nearly being on the brink of famine in the 60s to being self-sufficient in rice by the 1990s. So that is exciting. And at the University of Queensland, we've got a lot of capacity in plant breeding, and some of the things they talk about are quite amazing, especially breeding for drought tolerance and climate adaptation, which is we're very interested in, and other technology, biofortification, for example, so breeding to overcome micronutrient deficiencies amongst people, including stunting, which we know is a important issue in Indonesia. So those sort of technologies are exciting, and combined with a whole other series of technologies used widely, especially in grains. So remote sensing is important, where you can use satellite imagery down to 10 square meters and detect individual fields, even small fields in Indonesia, to be able to do crop forecasting and look for nutrient deficiencies. So that, combined with a whole series of information technology, which promises to revolutionize supply chain management and logistics of the sort of things that we're interested in as agricultural economists, and Stephen and others in transport and management. So that's very exciting. And I guess in terms of development projects, we're very interested in the way that these technologies can be applied and adapted on the ground in Indonesia, dominated by smallholder systems.
Thanks,
and that's exciting
Scott.
too.
Yes, well, now that you've mentioned it, let's have a look at the landscape of Indonesia. You work on the ground in Indonesia, and as you say, that there is deep expertise within that country in the agricultural research sector already. Can you describe to us what that smallholder farmer situation looks like? I mean, in Australia, we have lots of different setups for farming. What's the dominant scene in Indonesia that you're working with, that researchers are working with?
Thanks, Helen. That's a critical question. And I think in the last census, 2013, they counted about 30 million smallholder farmers. So that's households, and average areas of land, between 0.1 to 0.5 hectares. And those individual land areas can be divided between lots of plots. So we're talking about scattered farming systems and land areas, and that's critical for a whole range of production purposes and for technology. And it underpins everything. So the technologies that are introduced into that landscape, firstly, have to be suited and adapted for smallholders, so be appropriate in that environment. And there's a whole series of issues then about the dissemination, the extension of technologies amongst those sort of fragmented structures. And it's quite fascinating to see how that works in Indonesia. And Indonesia's got a very large and highly capable extension system. So talking a whole series of systems from national down to village level, and often overlaid each other, that are trying to disseminate research and technology into those smallholder systems. So that's critical to understand, and maybe the Indonesian colleagues here can speak a bit about that. But there's a whole range of other institutional structures that are important in that, especially group structures at local levels. So the way that kelompoks and groups, cooperatives work to bring farmers together so that they can work on production and marketing inputs, parts of the farming systems is very important. And then overlaid on top of that, I guess there are more corporatized systems. So that then issues of the way that big companies, so they might be on the input sides, fertilizer, pesticide companies, deal with, distribute inputs to those farmers, and how processing companies, so that could be flour mills or abattoirs or whatever, obtain product from those smallholder farmers. And those structures are very interesting.
That's a great rundown, thank you. And as you mentioned, we, there are so many layers, and this is something, Imron, Zuhri, I'll bring you into the conversation, because this is what you were dealing with as a technology company on the ground, working with smallholder farmers. How difficult was it initially to work with those farmers and get them to share their information and make them think about the technology and using it?
Yes, it's quite difficult because for some people who is not familiar with Indonesia, we are, like I said, a diverse country. So even a simple information that is required, for example, for the banks to help them to finance their productions, like how big is your land, it can be quite tricky to collect, because here I think we have at least 30 major different measurement units in Indonesia, for example. So if you're in Bali and ask the Balinese farmer, they will say, oh, my land is about 20 ARA. And if you go to Java, they will say, oh, my land is 200 ubins and 4 tumbaks. And some of these measurements are not actually quite exact. So yeah, so it can be quite challenging. And even the farmers itself not all of them have proper identity. So we have to start small, take baby steps, and also introduce the right technology with the right people as well. So you cannot just design everything from your boardroom. You have to go to the field and really understand how they work to be able to help them to collect all this information. So what we do is to create a simple applications, and with the help of the local young people who are more addressed to this technology, help the farmers, for example, to do land tagging. We create a very simple apps using GPS in a smartphone so the farmers can just walk around the land. So then we have a much more precise information of how big the land size is, and also the land location and the polygon. So this critical information then will be helpful for the banks to help them, and also other stakeholders. So that's just an example of getting just one information. Okay, so yeah, but it's not impossible.
Right. How did the local farmers feel about using technology? Were they a bit unsure at first, or even suspicious about what you were trying to do?
Of course, it's not always that easy, and sometimes the surprise is because they see the benefit from other angles. Like, for example, when we first helped them measure their land, and they were quite thankful to us, because finally they said, oh, at least I know now, when my father inherited the land, he was quite fair. So I did. So my brother doesn't get more than me. So it's okay. So but So yeah, so you have to work within their frame of mind. So I think the biggest challenge is how to make technology relevant to them, for them.
Thank you. And I will mention that we do have our chat room or our Q&A open. If you'd like to pop a question in there sometime during the course of the webinar, we'll definitely have a look at them and pick some out. We've talked about the smallholder farmers, and I'm going to go to Dr. Melony Sellars now, because my understanding, Melony, is that you're working, from our discussion, with a bigger kind of farming, one that is very switched on to the problem that they want to solve. Can you explain to us the work that you're doing in Indonesia?
Sure, thank you. So we're working with, I guess, medium to larger scale shrimp farmers in Indonesia to be able to help them to identify the risks of production earlier. So one of the biggest production risks in shrimp culture are pathogens or diseases. And so using the Genics technology, we're able to tell them 3 to 4 weeks earlier than when they have sick animals what pathogens in their culture systems, and those pathogens are about to increase in presence and prevalence. And so with that information, we're helping farmers to detect pathogens early and be able to implement management decisions that improve the profitability of a crop. Now, those management decisions can be very basic things, but they're very impactful in terms of the profit that the farmers are achieving. So if a farmer, for example, detects pathogen 4 weeks earlier than when he sees sick shrimp, he can say, well, I have aerators, so I can put more air into my ponds and my shrimp will grow better and be able to withstand the pathogen as they grow, and he'll still have a very profitable crop. Or he may be able to reduce feed inputs, stop sharing the nets of that pond with the other ponds, tell his neighbours to be cautious and wary. So we're working with these medium to larger shrimp production companies throughout the grow out periods, and also with their broodstock maturation and their post larvae, their seed stock, to be able to have an early detector of these risks and to be able to make these very important management decisions that make their crops profitable.
So when we were discussing this, Melony, I was thinking pathogens in shrimp, that sounds rather niche and confined as a problem for food production, but in fact, it's a significant problem all around the world. And can you just explain how widespread this is and why a medium-sized business in Indonesia is keen to work with that technology?
Sure. So across our food production sector, as humans produce their food, we tend to grow them at higher and higher densities in order to be able to produce them cost effectively. And as we do this, whether it's your shrimp or your cattle, etc., we start to come into the problem of pathogens during the production system, or diseases during the production system. And because they're in close contact with each other, you start to get the movement and spread of diseases and pathogens much more rapidly. And so this is a common problem that we can really help to better understand and strategies so that we can start to have a more secure food production channel for humans.
I think sometimes we forget about the impact that the changes in farming have and the concurrent problems that brings up. I'd like to go to Stephen McFallan now. You've raised lots of points which we'll come back to, Melony, but Stephen, I'm just sort of aware that all of this talk about food and technology, you still need to get it to the market. You still need to have a supply chain in place. You still need to have a logistics operation that you can trust. If you're going into a country like Indonesia, does your system help measure that, help people look at what that might look like, so to speak?
Yeah, hi, Helen. Yeah, well, yes, exactly. I mean, the tool, the transit tool, was developed really to provide some evidence for decision makers around investment in logistics. So to enable us to do that, we had to take on some of the challenges that Imron outlined in terms of going to the field and understanding what are the processes that are there, and make sure we capture them in our modelling. We also had to bear in mind the challenge that Scott outlined at 30 odd million smallholder farmers. We've got to capture the information across a very broad range of farming techniques, etc. So our model essentially follows the logistics process from the farm through the processes and distribution systems right through to market, and we capture that information and embed it into our models. And when we run the models with that high performance computing, we end up with a whole range of output. That information on its own is not much good unless you can get the information to the decision makers. So we've developed some web technology to enable those users to actually get at that information and look into what might be priority areas for investment. The biggest challenge for us really is to bring in the local logistics challenges. In Indonesia, being an island nation, the biggest challenge for us was understanding the challenge of the domestic shipping. But we're getting through that, and we're making some really good headway in terms of modelling that supply chain and getting information out.
Okay, fantastic. And Imron, can I go to you? Do you you collect data for on the ground farmers? Do you look at the supply chain as well? Is that part of your remit?
Yes, the end goal is actually to at some point map all this, the whole supply chain and value chain within the agriculture sector, because it's, the agriculture data in Indonesia is practically almost, if I can say, non-existent in the granular level. So that's why, due to this asymmetric information, that's why, like in food crop, for example, we have so many layers. Like in rice, I think it's up to 25 layers, which is ridiculous, So that's why we also use blockchain technology for practical terms, because this by having all the stakeholders that we work with recorded all this essential transaction in a unified single, even though distributed ledgers, to make it easier for us to consolidate all this information and make it traceable and visible for everybody to see, while at the same time also protecting the data of the farmers. So they are actually involved in this whole process since the beginning. Right now, we work together also with Prisma since in the beginning to experiment, to pilot on this. So first we work with the farmers, which is collecting the farmers' identity and their farmland and so on. And then right now we already work with financing institutions like banks. And also after 2.5 years of hard discussion, finally convinced insurance company to also in the ecosystem to provide crop insurance for the farmers. So now we are also working again with the help of Prisma to map out all these farm inputs stores within the area. So we want to create a closed loop ecosystem for these farmers, and do this after this pandemic situation. Now we actually start moving to downstreams. So we also work with other startups who are in the marketplace area to also join us in this ecosystem. So hopefully, by working together with other more people within the ecosystem, then slowly but sure we can start collecting all this information on the whole supply chain, and hopefully once we do that, then we can start optimizing the process organically, I think.
Thanks, Imron. Sorry, I'm just checking some of the questions that are coming through, and I'm going to go to a few of them just because of all the points that all the speakers have raised. I'm going to start with one from Pablo Miguens from the Monash Business School. Can you give some examples of agriculture subsectors where Indonesia has a competitive advantage? Scott, I wonder if you might be best placed to answer this one, or anyone else put up their hand?
Yeah, sure.
Feel free.
I can comment on that.
Yep.
I guess there's a number of different ways to look at competitive advantage, and especially through productivity, but one way is through export performance. And yeah, I mean, Indonesia is well known as being a very big exporter of plantation crops, or what's called the state crops in Indonesia. So things like rubber and cocoa, palm, coffee, tea. So Indonesia obviously a comparative advantage in those crops because of the agroclimatic conditions. But interestingly, even those big crops, those big plantation crops, which probably started in colonial era, all of those now are dominated by smallholders. And so smallholders are participating in that growth, and it's a source of competitive advantage for Indonesia to have that many smallholders in those estate crops and other things that we work in, including coastal fisheries and seaweed. And I guess at maybe a level down, a medium level export performance, probably talking about things like fruits and nuts. And there's a lot of variability. Indonesia imports a lot of potatoes and exports a lot of spices, for example. And I guess at the end that most economists would say that Indonesia has less of a comparative advantage in those big broad acre crops of cereals and grains. But there's a lot of nuances in there. For example, beef cattle. Does Indonesia have a competitive advantage in beef cattle? And you have to get down to that subsectoral level, which I think the question is about. Indonesia doesn't have a competitive advantage in cow-calf production, right? Because it needs to be low cost, but it does have a competitive advantage in feedlots where there's intensive feeding and there's cheap sources of feed, especially from those plantation crops that we talked about earlier. So there's a lot of nuance there, but that's a quick overview.
Yeah, a big question and well answered, thank you. Got a couple more questions from our audience. I'm going to go to Stephen first. There's one directly to you from Teddy K. Who would be the best institution to host your model here in Indonesia, I'm guessing? How can the private sector access the data, the modelling? As Imron said, reliable agricultural data is difficult to access in Indonesia. This gives you a good chance to explain how you collect data on the ground, I guess, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks very much, Teddy. It is a twofold question. So the first question is about how do we get the data on the ground. So we've teamed up with a group of local researchers in Indonesia through Petri Mitra Asia Lestaria, led by John Ackerman. And that team works very hard to arrange field visits for us to go and see the various crops through the whole supply chain, from the field through to the various processors, rice processors or sugar refineries, feedlots, right through to the market. So we follow that through, and we collect a lot of data along the way about elements of the supply chain and logistics process. So that information is highly valuable, and you don't get it from downloading data sheets. You've got to be on the ground to collect that. So we take that information and we combine it with the best information we can get from the various ministries around harvest yields, etc. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Transport and the likes have been very supportive. We've met with them a number of times, and they have provided us some really useful information around that sort of thing. As have enterprises such as Bulog, etc. I think the second part of the question is who might host it. Look, there's a whole heap of discussion there around that. I suspect that BAPPENAS may well be an agency that would be an ideal candidate. Our hopes is the tool will be embedded in government, be it BAPPENAS or other, and supported with trained in-house technical capability to add capacity for these agencies. Because the tool can do more than just give you the lay of the land. So it doesn't just give you a baseline. Once you've got that and you're satisfied it looks about right, you can then change elements of the system and see what sort of productivity benefits might arise. And that's probably one of the key values of the tool. So you can compare a range of different investment options and see where you might get productivity benefits, and also where those benefits play out. So, you know, whether they're sort of focused on one part of the system, or whether they end up downstream down to the smallholders, or etc. Look, I could go on. I could go on.
No, I think that gives us a good idea, and the fact that, you know, our BAPPENAS, who we had the Director of Agriculture as our guest speaker, is taking an interest in this sort of technology. It gives you some idea of the direction that Indonesia wants to move in and how that aligns with their policies as well. We have another question, and I'm going to go to Melony for this. Melony, because of your experience as a company going into Indonesia and working with a medium-sized to larger business, the question is from Richard Humphreys. Is technology enabling larger companies an entry into the agricultural sector in Indonesia, or is the focus on enabling local farmers to improve their production? Given the work that you've been doing so far, Melony, would you mind answering that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's a combination of both of those. At the moment, it really is focusing on the current players in the market and disrupting how they farm shrimp to improve profitability. But there is a lot of interest from the investors, especially in the archipelago region, for shrimp production as they look to expand in those regions. And there's a lot of government initiatives in Indonesia which are supporting those. And so for those investors, it really will just drive disruptive and a different type of business model for shrimp farming as they invest and move into that. So I'd say it's a combination of both. Definitely people that are already farming and implementing the Genics technologies are on the ground doing that today, whereas your investment group are starting to talk about it and look at how to implement that moving forward.
That's great. Thanks so much, Melony. You've all mentioned scale, and I'd like to ask Imron about this, because one of the key challenges, or one of the key elements that you think there needs to be focus, is not just helping farmers, but creating sustainable agriculture and showing that it's sustainable quickly, because the amount of arable land in Indonesia is going to other sectors and uses. And you also mentioned, Imran, not only do we need to prove the value of agriculture, but to have technologies that can scale up quite quickly. Can you just talk us through that a bit, why you have that view?
Yes, because, like, for example, in food crops, the smallholder farmers really are small. The average land in Java, for example, for rice is around 0.28 hectares. So it's a quarter of hectares. You know, if we don't do something for a lot of these farmers, it's not enough to make a living. So the tendency is for a lot of them trying to sell their land. So I don't know the latest one, but I think at some point the average land conversion in this country is around 4%. So we have to move fast. We have to move quickly. That's why, for example, that's why the way we collect information is through participatory models. So it's pretty much like the Uber version of this, you know, in our case. So we encourage people to download the apps, and then we give them incentive to help us collect information. And then the way we collect information, it also has to be thought up so it can be scaled fast. Like, for example, that's why it's important for us to collect the land polygons, for example, because once we have the land polygons, then we can use satellite, the cheap satellite technology, like the one we used in the past with planets, and now with the Japanese company called Access Space. Then we can monitor and predict the growth much more easily without having to ask the individual farmers. Right now, Access Space can give us satellite images every 15 days, and next year I think they promise us every 3 days. So by combining these participatory models, you know, pretty much like Uber version of it, and also using this other technology, and by thinking through what kind of data, so we don't try to collect as many data as possible, but critical data that we can use to make this process scaled. And I think the other thing, the strategy that we have to use is collaboration. So we collaborate with banks, and we collaborate with insurance company. We collaborate with other agri-tech, like for example, in insurance, we collaborate with another startup that specializes in insurtech. In marketplace, we collaborate with other agri-tech also that specialize in marketplace. I think if we have to work in collaborative fashion, and we have to create a platform that allows this all these components to work together, so we can scale this as fast as possible. That's the objective, because we are racing against this land conversion rate. Like in some part of Java, it's even worse. I think in some area, it's even go as high as 8%. Imagine that, 8% land conversion. That means in 15 years, that area doesn't have any agricultural land, which is sad.
This is a sobering statistic. Scott Waldron, sorry, I'm going to go to you. I've got a question which I think ties in with some of the research that, your research perspective will help. In beef and seaweed in Indonesia, it reveals a lot about those sectors and where innovation is needed in those sectors, and perhaps where the technology from other places can be of value. And we have a question from Paul McCardle on the recent trade agreement or economic agreement between the two countries, which talks about market complementary, finding industries that have complementation. So what areas or types of enterprises might fit that narrative? And you're seeing that in the research you're doing in the beef and seaweed sectors?
Well, as I was alluding to before, beef is one sector where there is a lot of complementarity between Australia and Indonesia, and there are others, especially in grains, for the reasons we're talking about. But I might just talk a little bit about seaweed, if we can, because this is the subject of the project we're doing for the Partnership for Australia-Indonesia Research. And it's quite fascinating, really, that in the 90s, Indonesia produced very little seaweed, and it's gone to a position now where it dominates the production of red seaweeds, so that are especially used for carrageenan, so which is used as a gelling compound in foods. And Indonesia, the issue that is outlined by including BAPPENAS and presidential decree, government roadmap, is Indonesia produces all this seaweed. The problem is that it's being exported in unrefined or semi-refined form. So the question then is how Indonesia can add value to that product. So do more domestic processing to increase the value of the product, to increase employment, to increase government revenue so they can provide services. And it's a very interesting industry, and Indonesia is trying to promote this by generating new food products, the use of seaweeds in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, fertilizers, biofuels, with a lot of food chemists and in industrial organization specialists working through that. And I think this sort of thing is critical for Indonesia. So instead of just exporting raw products, to be able to do more value adding and move up global value chains to generate more activity. And we're talking about agricultural technologies here, but really a lot of those off-farm technologies in the processing sector is critical for getting agriculture moving, increasing production, increasing incomes of smallholders.
That's great. Thanks, Scott, for giving us that. We've got time for one more question, or maybe two. Let's see how we go. I'm going to direct this to Stephen, because this is a problem that exists, not a problem, it's the way the system's set up in different countries. In Indonesia, this question from Yoga Muda Aditya, the farmers are facing a price risk because of the many intermediate middle men. Do you see the farm to table agri-tech could solve this sort of problem or situation. Obviously, it means, you know, neighbours in different parts of that supply chain. And in their opinion, many agri-tech act just like the digital middleman. Ooh, and I might go to Imron for that. So there we go, a two-parter. Stephen, if you for a start, looking at those, you know, those sort of grey areas, I guess, that come up in the agricultural sector and getting food to the consumer.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think first of all, the tool that we're developing doesn't set to set the agenda. It sets to provide information to decision makers, and it tries to quantify you know, costs along the supply chain. So so when you talk about those middlemen, you know, some of them are very important, I suspect, to the whole process, in that they connect farmers to markets, and some of them may, you know, take advantage of that situation. But what we try to do in the model is to capture that whole supply chain and those actors in the supply chain, and attribute a cost function to them, so we can see when we look at the whole system, so not just this particular supply chain, but the whole industry supply chain. We can then start to see just what impact each of those actors have across the supply chain, and, you know, where there might be a need to take some steps to improve the process. So it may not be about investing in roads or ports. It may actually be about regulations, etc., to improve the process flows. So the tool sets out to provide that sort of information to the decision makers. The second question about you know, the grey areas, you know, some of the challenges in transporting across the country have been in overloading, and you know, we've been urged by the number of stakeholders not to forget grey costs, which exist. So you know, we're trying to capture those elements also in it, not to make a judgment on them, but simply to have that information available for the decision makers to actually then decide how they might deal with it and where they can target their regulations or actions.
Thank you. And quick response from Imron. Technology, middlemen, how does it all work together?
Yes, I think again, we have to do this in baby steps. Like, for example, in food crops, you know, they can go as much as 25 layers. I think it's very difficult if we want to reduce that to just 3 layers at the moment. What we can do is like Steve mentions, you know, eliminate the useless ones, because some of these middlemen are still quite useful and they're very important in the structure. But there are also a lot of the useless middlemen who actually just contribute more to the cost. So if we can reduce that to half, that's already a big step, I think. And so yeah, so that from farm to table directly is still a long way. It's not that easy. I don't think there's any startup who can actually do that at the moment, you know, directly from farm to table. But I think if all these agri-tech startups start collaborating with one another and they actually attack one point in the value chain, focus in one part of the value chain, I think we can lower and lower the number of these layers in the futures. And I think because the opportunity is so big, you know, like I mentioned to you, Helen, right now it's quite ironic that these farmers, these poor people, actually living an expensive life. It's very expensive to be poor, like in any developing countries, right? For example, they pay up to 90, 120% of interest for the financing. You know, so there are a lot of components in a granular level that we can optimize a lot. And right now, because of the small lands, so a lot of them are not mechanized. So if we can make it, we can do land consolidation, and then for harvest we can mechanize it. That's already another 50% lower of the cost. You know, so there's a lot of things that we can do, and then we also need a lot of investment, for example, for modern mills. So then, like for example, in rice production, then we can utilize all the rice component from end to end. You know, so that means another revenue for farmers. So a lot of these things will contribute a lot to the increase of productivities if we look
productivity and income. That's great.
and
Thank
income.
you so much,
Yeah.
Imron. Yeah, which is of course one of the missions of HARA, is to help farmers on the ground. Last question, I can sneak one in very quickly to Dr. Melony Sellars. Melony, I'm curious to know, given that you're just in Indonesia, what's your overall view of the country's desire to improve not just food production, but sustainability?
Yeah, it's quite incredible. Indonesia really is a country that is seeking these inputs actively. They're very actively looking for the high-tech solutions and willing to learn and adjust their farming behaviours to make the best of these opportunities. So I've been pleasantly surprised, to tell you the truth, about the proactive nature of the people, particularly in the shrimp industry.
That's a great comment to end on. Thanks, Melony. Thanks for your perspective. And thank you to all our speakers today. We could have talked for so much longer. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. We do have some closing remarks, but I'd just like to acknowledge the time of Dr. Scott Waldron, Dr. Melony Sellars, Imron, Zuhri and Stephen McFallan, all very busy people with lots of knowledge, and we really appreciate you joining our conversation today. Thank you so much again. And now, to end this great conversation on agricultural technology and investment between Indonesia and Australia, I'd like to invite Alison Duncan to the room, the Minister-Counsellor for Economic Investment and Infrastructure at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, of course, for the Australian Government. Alison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Helen. And it's great to see such good participation in the event. I'd like to echo your thanks to Stephen, Melony, Scott and Imron for such an interesting and useful conversation. I really enjoyed their insights on how innovation is able to transform Indonesia's agriculture sector and supply chains. It's clear that there are some really good opportunities here for smart investors and for ag tech companies in Australia. And of course, with our new Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, it addresses some of the impediments to increasing Australian investment in Indonesia. For example, Indonesia has guaranteed under IA-CEPA that majority Australian-owned businesses can operate railways and road transport infrastructure, which is a great opportunity for investment in the agriculture supply chain. I welcome the partnership between CSIRO and BAPPENAS to further develop transit for Indonesia. As we heard from Stephen today, strategic supply chain investment has the potential to unlock significant productivity growth, and it also supports employment in Indonesia. And both of those things will help to power Indonesia's post-COVID economic recovery. I hope that this collaboration will enable closer economic investment and investment ties between our countries to support inclusive growth. I also recognise the great work of Australian and Indonesian innovators to improve the productivity of this really important sector. And it's been great to hear today from both Genics and HARA about the transformative impact their technologies are having in Indonesia. And Pak Anang and Pak Imron both talked about our PRISMA program. That's our partnership for promoting rural income through support of markets in agriculture. And it's great that HARA is collaborating with PRISMA. There's clear alignment here with our mission to help spur growth along the value chain by reducing constraints and barriers to farmer productivity. I think the discussion today has also really highlighted the power of collaboration between Australian and Indonesian researchers. It's been great to hear from Scott about how the partnerships fostered through the Australia-Indonesia Centre's PAIR program are helping to boost production, add value and support sustainability. And I'd also like to, of course, thank AIC for hosting this great discussion as part of their In Conversation speaker series. And thanks to Helen for moderating. The Australian Government is always keen to support our ongoing collaboration with Indonesian partners and to promote ag tech and investment in Indonesia. So thanks again to everyone for participating.
Thanks, Alison Duncan, for those very kind words. We appreciate that, and great to have you join us for the webinar today. Now, we do have a little survey at the end. We'd love you to fill that out just so that we know we're delivering something of value to you. I'd also like to remind you about our Real Oz Ind short film festival / competition. The winners have been announced and we got them up online until the end, until the 1st of December, end of November, lost track of the months. Until the 1st of December, you can go on and actually see the winning films. There's some brilliant short films in there. Hopefully that just showed you the web page that you can go to. You can watch it at your leisure and also learn more about this competition, film festival, which has been going for 5 years now. We have a retrospective available as well. Now, this webinar actually finishes our In Conversation series for the year. Sad to see it go. But we will be back with some more exciting discussions. We're planning those at the moment. And of course, we will be looking at how Indonesia and Australia can grow stronger together and be stronger partners in the region. So keep an eye out. We'll be keeping information coming to your email or to your WhatsApp or however you get it to let you know what we're up to and how you can join into our next conversation. Thank you for your time and looking forward to having you join us again soon.